Earlier this week, Travis Kalanick, the CEO of Uber, was recorded yelling at one of his drivers. In the video, the driver is seen calmly asking Travis why the Uber company has decided to drop reimbursement rates for their drivers. And Travis, the CEO, responds disrespectfully toward the driver. After the video was publicly released, at first, Travis made matters worse by defending his attitude on social media, by blaming the driver. On Thursday, Travis released a public apology for his arrogant behavior, and he acknowledged that he did not set a good example, saying, "It's clear this video is a reflection of me, and a stark reminder that I must fundamentally change as a leader." On Friday morning, Travis went one step further, announcing he would take additional rides with his drivers and listen to their concerns. Sort of like undercover boss, except they'll know he's the boss. He'll use the opportunity to apologize personally to every driver he insulted and to the local driver team for his failure. Prior to Travis's failure, he thought as CEO of the company he was immune to blunders and that he could not fail. Sadly, this was the attitude of Adam and Eve. And not only is it an attitude that they have, but it could be the unintended behavior of students who will be graduating from Fairfax schools in Virginia because the school system has decided to help students avoid the painful experience of failure. The school board has done this by implementing what they call a no-zero policy, which has gone into effect this school year, which means middle and high school students can never score a 0 on homework, quizzes, or tests. The lowest score they can receive is a 50. Students can turn work in late, and if they score 80% or lower on a test, the student can retake the test. In addition, all the student has to do is show a good faith effort, and they receive a 50. The theory behind this policy is that when a student scores a 50 instead of a 0, they have a chance to improve their grade, which means that instead of giving up, they'll potentially remain enrolled in school. Critics of the no-zero policy claim the lack of being able to fail a test or a class is not preparing students for college and the working world where failure happens. In addition, no-zero policies allow students to advance even if they don't grasp the material. And this policy will harm students because they're unable to learn from their mistakes. And as we know, mistakes are a part of life. Sir James Dyson said that if we are able to learn from our mistakes, if we're able to improve, then we can take failure to lead to progress. Sir Dyson, by the way, is the inventor of the Dyson vacuum cleaner. And before his first dual cyclone cleaner hit the market, he spent 15 years creating 5,126 versions that failed before he created one that worked. You learn from your failures. Thus in life, school, and work, failure needs to be an option. Otherwise, we don't learn and we don't grow. Without failure, we can't see the truth. Look at what happened with Adam and Eve. Adam was alone in the Garden of Eden, and God took him on an amazing tour looking at the plants and the trees. Then God instructed Adam, saying, "You can eat from any tree you desire except one, which is in the middle of the garden. You shall not eat of it, otherwise you will die. You will fail, you'll receive a 0. Later, Adam instructed his companion Eve about God's rule, but he added to the rule, saying, "Do not touch it, otherwise you will die." And it's this twisting and misinterpretation of God's original rule that creates the perfect recipe for failure. Oh, and of course it didn't help that a crafty serpent also appeared. The serpent asked Eve, "What did God say about the tree?" Eve responded, "Do not eat of it or touch it, for surely you will die." But the seed of doubt was planted in her mind when the serpent touched the fruit and didn't die. Then the seed of doubt began to take root when the serpent established a no-zero policy declaring, you won't fail. In fact, you'll have better than a zero because you'll be like God, knowing good and evil. She was tempted and she accepted the symbol of power, pride, and lust for possessions, and she chomped into the sweet temptation. Sadly, this discussion between Eve and the serpent revealed her weakness, which has profound negative ramifications for relations between men and women for millennia. However, there are two things most people overlook. First, in Genesis 3:6, when the text describes Adam's location in relation to Eve, it uses the Hebrew preposition imma, which means with her. Secondly, the Genesis text says Eve turned to Adam, suggesting that he stood slightly off to one side. Thus, with her or to one side, he was her accomplice. Adam watched this scene unfold, and when he realized that neither the serpent nor Eve died, he also bit into the sweet fruit of temptation. It reminds me of the dad who sits on the couch waiting to see if his son will stick a penny in the empty lamp socket. Equally, Adam and Eve failed, and their story forms the basis of the story of humanity. Adam and Eve were tempted by power, by pride, and by a lust for possessions. Equally, they gave in, and in my opinion, were equally responsible for seeking worldly things rather than the things of God. Their failure reminds me of the plot of C.S. Lewis's book, The Screwtape Letters. In the story, Wormwood was being trained by his mentor, Uncle Screwtape, and Wormwood's task was to darken the heart of humanity, referred to as the patient. Wormwood would encourage the patient to love worldly things and reject God by praying for the possession of objects instead of praying for spiritual matters. He would train the patient to be oversensitive until everything, even the patient's mother, was irritating. Wormwood assisted the patient to turn their attention from God toward themselves, so when praying for courage, they would turn boastful and insecure and fearful of the world. They would attempt to control the lives of others by manipulating the economy and politics. They would create unfair laws and policies that only served to entrap and imprison those whom the patient feared. And like the serpent, Wormwood twisted God's words that the patient believed they were incapable of failing. In Adam and Eve's case, they believed they could not fail, and they lusted for power, for pride, and possessions instead of maintaining their trust in God. And once they gave in to temptation, then their eyes were opened, and they realized they had disobeyed God. Now, ideally, with their eyes open and knowing the difference between good and evil, they should have approached God and confessed what they did. And even asked God for a do-over. Instead, they were arrogant and they were rude. Instead of accepting responsibility, Cain blamed Eve and God, and Eve blamed the serpent and God. Notice the common theme: blame each other and God. Their refusal to accept responsibility revealed their true character. They didn't want to trust in God. They wanted to be like God. They wanted to control their own lives. And they didn't apologize for their greedy desire, because in their sinful way they believed God should apologize to them for making the tree in the first place. Thus, they failed. Their immature behavior reminds me of the parent-teacher conferences when parents accuse the teacher of unfairly failing their child. Adam and Eve did not handle their zero very well. They were angry, but not at themselves. Notice, they weren't angry at their own actions. They were angry because they were caught. Instead of admitting their failure and accepting responsibility for their actions, they blamed each other, made excuses, and blamed God. Together, Adam and Eve failed. And though the tree was their first failure, they continued to fail as they blamed each other and failed to recognize God's true character. They failed to see that God did not carry out the death sentence. If you remember earlier in Genesis, God had threatened that death would occur in the day you eat it, Genesis 2:17. Yet God responded to their failure not with the full weight of judgment, but with unexpected mercy. It's intriguing. If Facebook had existed back then, one would have thought God would have begun streaming on Facebook Live their immature responses with the caption, #EpicFail. Instead, God remained like a nurturing parent and led Adam and Eve away from the center of the garden and then sat with them and made them real clothing. Though Adam and Eve were disobedient, God remained obedient. Based on God's character, I believe God was waiting for them to learn from their failure. But in their arrogance, Adam and Eve refused to see, even up to their expulsion, that God was still offering them a do-over. God allowed them to look at their failure and learn from it, which a no-zero can't do. If we couldn't fail or experience disappointment, we wouldn't learn much. In the case of Adam and Eve, they didn't learn from their failure, and this failure will continue to play out in the lives of their children, Cain and Abel, and in their ancestors' stories, Jacob and Esau, Joseph and his brothers, and it plays out even in today's world. We constantly wrestle between choosing to remain faithful to God and seeking worldly power and worldly possessions. The temptation of greed and jealousy still arises today as humanity fails to learn its lesson and return obediently to God. Thankfully, just as God did not give up on Adam and Eve, so God has not given up on the human family. God remains obedient even when we're not. And God remains merciful and slow to anger. And through Jesus, we are shown God's faithfulness. And through Jesus, He informs us we can return to God. Jesus also demonstrated how to defeat temptation. He said, trust in God, do not test God. And keep your life focused on living faithfully for God and in love with God. Further, Jesus taught that when we become distracted by our lust for power, pride, and possessions, we reject God, and in pursuit of these worldly things we fail. We receive a 0. However, Jesus said we can transform our 0. We can transform our failure by repenting and returning to God. Jesus taught us that we can learn from our failures and mistakes and humbly ask God to assist us to turn our disobedience into obedience and our arrogance into innocence. We can humbly take responsibility for our actions and words and seek forgiveness. It's a lesson that needs learned, whether from our failure or from the failure of someone else. In a TEDx presentation, Dr. Sean Ray Furch, a leadership professor at Gonzaga University, shared an interesting incident that taught him a lesson about humility and forgiveness. Dr. Furch says he was visiting his wife's parents when his father-in-law made a sharp comment at the dinner table to his wife. After dinner, Furch's father-in-law approached him saying, "I'd like to ask your forgiveness for the way I treated my wife at the dinner table." Dr. Furch says he didn't know how to respond, so finally his father-in-law explained. In our family, we ask forgiveness of the person whom we harmed, and we also ask for forgiveness of everybody who was there in order to restore the dignity of the one who was harmed. If we're willing to learn from our mistakes and from Adam and Eve's mistakes and failure, we can discover God's grace and mercy. We can see God's love, which was displayed for us in the life and ministry of Jesus Christ. And this morning and during the season of Lent, as we contemplate on when we have failed to remain obedient to God by choosing worldly possessions and worldly power instead of God's grace and protection and peace, we are invited to recall God's gift of grace. We can acknowledge that we are capable of failing, which is why we need to return to God and become wholly devoted to God. And during the season of Lent, we can examine our lives, explore our mistakes, learn to trust in God again, and humbly live as God's children, loved and forgiven. I invite you to pray with me as we journey through Lent.